It's quiet. Sure.
Well, it got quiet, so I think we should probably start. Welcome, everyone. We're excited to be here as part of the Flourishing Together, Becoming an Accessible and Welcoming Church Summer Seminar. This is offered through the Calvin Institute of Christian Worship. This is one of 2 public events that we're holding. The other one is tomorrow night, but it does require registration, so hopefully you're registered if you're coming. My name is Kate Strader, and I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Kevin Timpe. Dr. Timpe has held the William H. Jellema Chair in Christian Philosophy since coming to Calvin University in 2016. He has been a visiting faculty or fellow at Oxford University, Peking University, Innsbruck University, Notre Dame, and Calvin Theological Seminary. His scholarship focuses on a range of issues in the philosophy of disability, virtue ethics, metaphysics of free will, and the philosophy of religion. He has written or edited 12 books and has published over 70 journal articles, chapters in books, and encyclopedia articles. His most recent monograph on embodiment, dependence, and God will be released by Cambridge University Press next month. Beside all of these academic achievements, Dr. Timpe is also a dear colleague, a mentor, and a friend to me. Our paths cross over the work of advocating for accessibility and inclusion in our community. It's the best, though, when that work crosses paths over a really good cup of coffee. So I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Timpe to you.
Thank you, Kate. That was loud. I'll adjust. Tonight, I want to talk about some of the ways that I think the church can do better in caring for intellectually disabled individuals and their families, because otherwise we can't all flourish. I think that as the church, we flourish together. But I want to begin somewhere else, and that's with the American writer and civil rights activist James Baldwin. We are coming up in August on the 100th year since his birth. There's a black and white image of Baldwin enjoying a cigarette. Baldwin wrote, and these are the words on the slide, "History is not the past, it's the present. We carry our history with us. Our current reality is shaped by the histories that have led us here. We can't seek to build a better future without taking seriously where we are now." So thinking about what the church can do so that intellectually disabled people are not left out, what our ministries with, to, and from disabled individuals should be like, requires us to think carefully about the past and present in ways that perhaps might be unpleasant. Many intellectually disabled individuals, as well as their families, their caregivers, are not able to fully participate in all parts of our civic lives, including some of our local congregations, because of the lasting effects of the history of cultural and social exclusion of intellectually disabled individuals. Helping people realize that they are valued requires our congregations to be ones that make it clear, and these are the words of, I'm going to blank on her name now. Cole Riley, in a recent book, This Here Flesh, Cole Riley writes, "We don't just welcome you or accept you, we need you. We are insufficient without you. Making sure that others feel this way is one way of caring for them. It's unfortunately common for churches to use language of inclusion and belonging without recognizing that there's a practical reality of exclusion that remains. In this talk, I'll explore not only how such care for individuals and their families requires repentance for past exclusion, but requires us to think beyond mere ministries to or programming for intellectually disabled people. We also have to confront the history of exclusion that shapes the present reality lived beyond the walls of our congregations, which in turn requires helping those that we care about be able to get all the resources they need in order to flourish. It's only when it is clear that our lives are insufficient without them that they will be convinced that our churches too are insufficient without them. and only then will we do the work to flourish together. So my talk today then has three main sections. The way in which intellectually disabled folks have been left out in the past, failing to flourish in the present, and the need especially for care and solidarity. Those aren't the only things that we need, but those are some of the things that we need. A fair bit of the work that I've done over the past few years seeks to take seriously and address the myriad ways that our culture is unjust towards those of us who are disabled. As Leah Hunt Hendricks and Astra Taylor write in their recent book on solidarity, which I'll again return to in a little bit, advancing the struggle for justice requires looking back and taking our history of exclusion seriously. Now, there are two problems with trying to give some history as one task among three in a talk like this. The first is that wherever I start the history, it'll be an arbitrary point. I'm not going to start at the very beginning. That was a joke to Julie Andrews? I don't know. Some musical. Second, even though my focus throughout this talk is going to be on the American church, the church has always been alongside and enmeshed in the larger American culture. There's no way of dealing only with those parts of our history that are explicitly part of the American church without severing off, literally butchering, central parts of that larger story. For present purposes, I'm going to focus on, and again, this is arbitrary and artificial, primarily on the last 100 to 120 years of how the American church has tended to treat those with disabilities, and especially intellectual disabilities, with an eye towards how the church has bought into and often reinforced the larger ideology of ableism that has characterized much of our country, indeed much of the developed world since the Industrial Revolution. During the colonial period, I said I was going to start 120 years ago, and I'm going back. Brief transition. I'm bad at doing only what I'll say. During the colonial period, most intellectually disabled people were members, neither rejected nor despised, of their local communities, an expected part of often small-town life, more the object perhaps of pity than malice or animosity. But with industrialization, that was a picture of the Solidarity book that I mentioned. Forgot to put in my notes. There was a slide. Black and white picture of inside of a factory during the Industrial Revolution. With the increasing shift of work to urban centers, what to do with intellectually disabled individuals became a growing social and political issue rather than one just for families and local governments. In light of the increasing pressures for economic progress, these economic pressures would come to devalue disabled individuals. When the primary locus of work was divorced from the home or the homestead, intellectual disability would be seen as an economic drain, a threat often to national progress. In his book on the history of intellectual disability in the United States, James Trent argues that, quote, the economic vulnerability of these people and their families, more than the claims made for their intellectual or social limitations, has shaped the kinds of treatment offered to them, end quote. If true, that should give us pause. Almshouses and what were then called idiot schools. I have a black and white photograph from East New York City, labeled the Idiot School from December 1867. Almshouses and idiot schools were less about education than extracting a small degree of economic productivity, and they increased in number. During the second half of the 19th century, the treatment of intellectual disability came to more greatly reflect what we'd think of as incarceration and warehousing. Black and white photograph of what was at the time called an epileptic colony, where you can see, 20 cribs, about half of them currently occupied, where the care that such individuals would receive was largely a function of the ability of the superintendents in charge of these facilities to control those who are labeled intellectually disabled. And some of these institutions had a death rate during the first year of people in them of up to 80%. The Immigration Acts of 1882 and 1924, here we have a slide of immigrants departing. I can't remember if this is on Ellis Island or in San Francisco. But these immigration acts allowed government officials to restrict the immigration of those who are disabled or even just thought to likely become so. Individuals with intellectual impairment, epilepsy, mental illness were specifically denied entrance into the United States. The steamship companies that brought disabled individuals to U.S. ports of entry and then were turned away at the door were fined as much as $1,000 per offense. That's not adjusted for inflation. In the early 20th century, immigration officials were told, quote, "Any mental abnormality whatsoever justifies the statement that the alien is mentally defective, a judgment that can be used to prevent an individual's immigration into the United States," end quote. The end of the 19th and the first few decades of the 20th century saw the rise then of eugenics, in which intellectual disability was often seen as a menace and a threat to social progress. The slide contains a number of eugenic posters that were displayed in the United States. The central line reads, "Some people are born to be a burden on the rest." For various reasons, the acceptance of eugenics in the late 19th century and 20th centuries were largely a Protestant phenomenon, with Catholics in general being more concerned and critical of the eugenic programs, perhaps because they tend to have a more developed theological anthropology and theology of sex, including systematic views about birth control. Many Catholics were, in fact, among the earliest outspoken critics of eugenics. From its start, including the influential work of Francis Galton, who coined the term eugenics in an 1883 book, Inquiries into Human Faculty, eugenics was especially concerned with intellectual disability, even while it also sought to prevent physical disability. There was a concern to prevent those people who were deemed feeble-minded, degenerate, mentally defective, not just from overbreeding, but from reproducing at all. And many of these terms that I'm using in scare quotes, but these were the terms that were used at the time. As I sometimes tell my students, reporting, not endorsing. The history of eugenics, two other U.S. posters. "I'm a burden to myself and the state. Should I be allowed to propagate? I cannot read the sign. By what right have I children?" This history is, of course, closely intertwined with our country's history of sexism, classism, anti-Semitism, fear of immigration, and especially racism, which, of course, themselves are all intertwined. Carl Pearson, who was the first Galton Professor of Eugenics at University College London and took over the Galton Laboratory for National Eugenics when Galton stepped down in the UK, called for the creation, quote, "of a homogeneous white race whose fertility shall markedly dominate that of the black," end quote. There's nothing pleasant to be found here. In the 19th century, institutions, quite common in both England and the US, were one way of preventing procreation. This is an image of an institution from, I believe, 1930s in Virginia. For many eugenicists in the US, that segregation didn't seem to be strong enough, so they took more forceful steps. Many states passed laws prohibiting those considered feeble-minded or epileptic from marrying. This, too, wasn't enough, and the U.S. history of forcible sterilization began. As a map, the white states, the states that are in white are the ones that in 1910, 1910, bottom left 1920, top right 1930, bottom right 1940, that had forcible sterilization laws. You'll see that by 1940, it's most of them. The state of Indiana first legalized the forced sterilization of disabled individuals in 1907. By 1912, 8 states had similar laws. While the laws applied primarily to those with intellectual or developmental disabilities, individuals who are blind or deaf were sometimes also forcibly sterilized. Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes said in the decision in the Buck versus Bell case, quote, "3 generations of imbeciles is enough." And that Supreme Court decision is still on the books. It is still legal in numerous states in the US, including Idaho, where I moved to Michigan from, to forcibly sterilize those that the state deems sufficiently disabled. The Buck versus Bell case upheld the forced sterilization of individuals with disabilities, which would come to be somewhere between 80 and 100,000 in the 20th century in the US. Almost all of whom were female, many of whom were minorities. California's sterilization law was so popular, it actually became the inspiration for the Nazi eugenic practices in their Action T4 program. And here we have a slide of 2 intellectually disabled folks on the left who were killed by the Nazis, and on the right, a cemetery of the Action T4 program. Forced sterilizations continued in the US into the 1980s. And as I already mentioned, Buck versus Bell is still the law of the land. There was also significant pressure to hide disability through what came to be called the ugly laws. Susan Schweik here has a fantastic book on this. The images of the cover of her book, The Ugly Laws, Disability in Public. And you see a woman sitting with a sign around her neck labeled blind. These were a series of laws passed by cities in the late 19th and early parts of the 20th century that criminalized the presence of visible disability in public. Though not the first, Chicago's ugly law, which was passed in 1881, is perhaps the best known. And it read, "Any person who is diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed so as to be an unsightly or disgusting object, or an improper person to be allowed in or on the streets, highways, thoroughfares, or public places in the city, shall not therein or thereupon expose himself to public view under the penalty of a fine." Notice that the wording of this law refers to those who are diseased, maimed, mutilated, or in any way deformed as improper persons or objects. 5 years after San Francisco's ugly law was passed, concerned about the influx of disabled Chinese immigrants, the state of California enacted a law limiting immigration for those deemed to be, quote, lunatic, idiot, deaf, blind, crippled, or infirmed persons, end quote. And it should be noted that according to Susan Schweik, whose work I'm drawing on here, the last documented arrest in the United States via the ugly laws was in Omaha, Nebraska in 1974. A year after an amendment to the Federal Vocational Rehabilitation Act outlawed discrimination on the basis of disability. One might hope that the church would have rallied against this cultural devaluing of disabled lives. You're like, oh, that was the bad history. Now comes the good news. Nope. While I again recognize the complexity of history, unfortunately, there was not significant resistance from large parts of the Protestant church. It was easy for the church to swallow many of the assumptions that eugenics made, in part because of the long history of equating disability with sin or brokenness or fallenness in church history. Thanks, Paul. Members of the Christian faith not only unjustly treated individuals with intellectual disabilities, but they were central in shaping the culture and policies I just canvassed that would lead to widespread oppression of intellectually disabled persons. Many of those who passed the laws and ran the institutions I've mentioned self-identified as Christians. The same is true of a number of influential figures in the American Eugenics Society. They even put out a eugenics catechism to capitalize on their connection with the church, which included the following question. Does eugenics contradict the Bible? Answer. The Bible has much to say for eugenics. It tells us that men do not gather grapes from thorns and figs from thistles. The same society ran a eugenics sermon competition in 1926. My colleague, Kristen Dumais, told me about this book shortly after I got here. Judged by Christian clergy, resulted in over 300 pro-eugenics sermons that were submitted. So on the right is the cover of the Preaching Eugenics book, and then a short advertisement that ran in papers on how you could get $1,000 for writing what was deemed the best one. And all of this is unfortunately just the start. I haven't yet mentioned the history of medical experimentation in the United States without consent, like the intentional infecting of residents at the Willowbrook State School with hepatitis C, an image of the Willowbrook State School. If you have not read Christmas in Purgatory. It's the documentation that started this. Geraldo Rivera won the Pulitzer for investigative journalism. It's rough. We should know our history. Doctors at the Yale New Haven Hospital killed 43 disabled infants through lack of treatment, as they described in 1973 in the New England Journal of Medicine. Rather than let them face lives devoid of meaningless humanhood. That was their quote. Then there's the fact that disabled individuals make up between a third and half of all people killed by U.S. law enforcement officers. 90% of intellectually disabled persons will be sexually assaulted in their life. 66% of disabled adults are unemployed. Disabled adults are more than twice as likely as non-disabled adults to live in poverty. It's even higher for those with intellectual disabilities. And even our system of juvenile justice is deeply ableist, as up to 85% of children in juvenile detention have at least one disability. Anybody feeling optimistic yet? My students say I have a knack of making things depressing. A colleague at my previous university actually nicknamed me the chicken of despair. I told her thanks. It would be naive to think that the weight of this history has somehow magically been left behind. Our past shapes our present. According to Dennis Durst, quote, while notions of the unfit are now more subtly expressed, both in the church and without, they are not completely absent from the 21st century, end quote, including how the American church has been at best on the sideline and likely more accurately actively involved in much of that history. As a recent article by Eric Carter reminds us, the relationship between disabled individuals and our local churches is not uniform, it's complex. He writes, quote, faith communities have sometimes been known for radical hospitality, support, and inclusion. At other times, they have been marked more by hesitation, resistance, and exclusion, end quote. Most of us, I think, like the good stories. Most of us are not told the hard stories. This complexity acknowledged in his most recent book, How Ableism Fuels Racism, and there's a picture of Lamar Hardwick on the right-hand side. Autistic pastor Lamar Hardwick writes that it's not obvious to many people, quote, that Western Christianity has been complicit in upholding the sanctity of able-bodiedness. It should be obvious. We need to own our history. It's clear Hardwick's book thinks that in many parts of the American church, this culture of able-bodiedness is not just the past, it's still the present. It's why he wrote the book. Hardwick notes that, quote, ableism and racism and all other forms of marginalization remain entangled in our practice of Christianity today, end quote. Hardwick intends his book as a challenge to the sin of ableism and a call to the church to act justly. As I discussed in my earlier Disabilities and Inclusive Communities, there's a picture of the book on the bottom left. It's got a lovely pink painting that was commissioned by an intellectually disabled artist for the cover. The rest of the slide is someone from behind wearing noise-canceling headphones. As I discussed in that book, one survey found that adults with disabilities in the U.S. are approximately 40% more likely to never attend church, synagogue, or other place of worship than non-disabled adults. The odds of an autistic child never attending a religious service, for example, are double what they are for the general population. More than half of parents with disabled children report that their children have been excluded at church because of their disability. Disabilities that affect social interactions, such as intellectual and developmental disabilities, make people feel less welcome in places of worship than do physical disabilities. And the more severe the disability, the less likely the person will be regularly involved in a worshiping community. Even those that do attend worship are significantly less likely to participate in other kinds of church involvement. And again, I got this from your recent article that you shared with me, like church potlucks. I confess this is our family's experience. Even if the whole family is there on Sunday morning, after 2 hours, we don't have another hour and a half of awkward social interaction in us. We just walk out the door. It's unfortunately common for churches to use language of inclusion and belonging without recognizing that the practical reality of exclusion remains. Sometimes this practical problem is a lack within the church, but sometimes it's a practical problem in the lives of the families that have to live, to function within a larger culture that disadvantages them basically across every dimension of human life. What I want to suggest, and this is a theme I'll be developing in a number of ways going forward, is that we need to think not only what churches do in terms of their actual ministries and the attitudes in the local congregation. These things matter. But we also have to think how the church engages the larger culture. To see what I mean, let's briefly return to James Baldwin. Baldwin was friends, Baldwin again on the left, this time not smoking, but on the right, his friend William Styron, who is smoking. Styron is best known for his novels Sophie's Choice and The Confessions of Nat Turner, for which he won the 1968 Pulitzer Prize for Fiction. Styron grew up and, from the available historical record, remained Christian. Imagine that sometime after Baldwin, who himself walked away from the Christian faith because how he saw it either the church as either a cause or indifferent to the suffering of blacks in America. Imagine after Baldwin walked away from the faith, he went to church with Styron in his hometown of Newport News, Virginia, sometime during their friendship, say 1960. The black and white image of a church. As was likely given the time and place, at Styron's church, Baldwin would probably have been the only African American in the church that Sunday morning. After all, Martin Luther King remarked on Meet the Press in the year 1960 that it is one of the shameful tragedies that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is one of the most segregated hours in America. In such a case, what would Baldwin want from the church, given the cultural climate of racism, injustice, oppression? After all, remember that in the lead up to and aftermath of the Brown versus Board of Education to desegregate public schools, the second half of the 1950s saw the largest increase in private Christian schools in our country's history. It was an attempt to avoid desegregation on behalf of our churches. What Baldwin would want, what he needed, is not mere individual welcoming, people to greet him, though I suspect he'd be glad that people sharing the pews with him weren't racists and didn't want to lynch him. He didn't need merely a program for ministry to blacks. Presumably, he'd want a church willing to not only admit the larger cultural of Christian racism, but one eager to participate in the civil rights movement, one eager to link arms with him in the 1963 March on Washington or the 1965 March from Selma to Montgomery. The image is a black and white photo of 3 white Christian clergy linking arms with MLK. The Catholic priest just to the left of King is Father Hesburgh, for whom the Touchdown Jesus Notre Dame Library is now named, the Hesburgh Library. That's what Baldwin would have wanted to see. That is, as someone very attuned to how racism is not just a characteristic of individuals, but deeply embedded in culture and reinforced by our social institutions and structures, Baldwin surely would have felt more valued if the church had been at the forefront of advocating for better treatment, cultural transformation, and policy change for blacks. Merely welcoming him on a Sunday morning isn't going to do it. Only admission of the American church's complicity in racism, repentance, and willingness to work alongside Baldwin and other civil rights advocates for cultural and political change could do that. And while the American church, as I've already mentioned in at least one way, was not uniformly on the side of racial civil rights, you've got Hesburgh, and you've got the rise of private Christian schools, especially in the South. Many religious individuals and organizations were crucially active in the civil rights movement. To return again to how ableism fuels racism, Hardwick notes that religious activism was crucial to the push to pass the Civil Rights Act. In contrast, the disability rights movement and subsequent passing of the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, had far less of a connection to the faith community. That's Hardwick playing gentle. Saying that there was far less of a connection doesn't tell the story. In fact, religious groups concerned for religious liberty has regularly in our country's history taken precedent over disability rights, and the ADA was opposed by large sections of the church. There's an image of a letter from Daniel Heimbach to the White House, and in this letter, the American Evangelical Association lists about 25 to 30 denominations that signed off on opposition to the ADA. And the CRC is listed. Their advocacy to be exempt from the ADA was successful. Religious institutions, not only churches, but schools like Calvin, remain exempt to the ADA to this day. Commenting on this situation, Hardwick writes that, quote, with the use of religious liberty as a means of exempting themselves from providing federally mandated accommodations for disabled people, religious institutions also effectively distance themselves from practicing a faith that demands involvement in social justice. And I've read my Old Testament. Christianity commits us to activism for social justice. The exception, this is Hardwick continuing. The exemption of the church from the ADA based on religious liberty has had a far greater impact than just providing accommodations for disabled people. It has also become the platform for many churches and congregations to distance themselves from practicing racial justice. End quote. As the fictitious Baldwin example shows, I want to suggest that given the history I've canvassed earlier, what is needed is a public admission from the American church of its eugenic past. I know 3 denominations that have actually done this. Corporate repentance for the present ableism that churches made possible, and a willingness to walk alongside disabled individuals and their families for policy and cultural change. For the issues that families with intellectually disabled members face aren't merely what's going on in our local congregations. Their programming or individual attitudes, or what Eric calls the congregational contents. I mean, that matters, right? How many of us leave the rest of our lives behind when we come to church on Sunday morning? It's a luxury most of us don't have. The present is largely, though not uniformly, marked by a culture of disdain for, unease with, and distrust of marginalized groups, including persons with disabilities. We can't abandon them or merely support them from the sidelines in a culture of disdain and marginalization. And this point is, of course, not just about disabled individuals. I know that after last week, many of our LGBTQ members, their allies in the CRC, are also wrestling with feelings of increased unease and marginalization. According to disability theologian Mary Jo Iozio, not convinced I'm getting that right, okay, might be getting that right, quote, like women and people of color and queer folks, people with disability are disadvantaged on account of institutionalized systemic injustices that denied and continued to deny them access to the means of acquiring the skills that would hone their potentials, end quote. If we really value intellectually disabled individuals and want to help them flourish, then we won't let their current struggles stand unopposed. Baldwin moved to Paris in 1948, lived there for nearly a decade, in part so that he could just get out of America's culture of racism. He found a different culture of racism in France. While living there, he realized that the American approach to racial niceness that doesn't address the hard issues did nothing but, quote, bolster an image. In much the same way, I want to suggest that a religious response to intellectually disabled individuals and their families that doesn't address these larger structural and cultural issues just bolsters an image. You don't get to participate in decades of social isolation, political marginalization, and suddenly claim everything is fine because you and the people in your local congregation have goodwill. What disabled people need isn't a mere concern for image, mere goodwill. What they need is sufficient care for folks to engage in acts of corporate solidarity. So this is the 3rd section, which I'll focus on care and solidarity, but I couldn't find a Google image that had them in the right order. So I'm dyslexic. Pretend I just got them backwards for that reason. In the first 2 sections of the talk, drew heavily on history. This last section draws a bit more heavily on philosophy, which is actually my training. I said at the beginning of the talk that we need to make sure that disabled people know, quote, we don't just welcome you or accept you, we need you. We are insufficient without you. If you're spending a Monday night here to hear this talk, or to watch the live stream, or maybe later on YouTube, I suspect you already agree with that need. I hope I don't have to make the case to the folks in this room, we need intellectually disabled people in our churches. I hope I don't need to argue here that our communities, including our church communities, are worse off due to the exclusion of disabled folks. In her wonderful book on the philosophy of disability and care ethics, Eva Feder-Katay writes the following. This is a picture on the bottom right of Eva and her adult intellectually disabled daughter, Sesha, that she talks about in much of her work. I love Katay's work. She writes, "To exclude people with a certain disability from the realm of intrinsic value is as if we were to say all artworks are valuable except those sketched in charcoal. If we eliminated these, what would be lost? What is lost is simply all the artworks that might be sketched in charcoal. We don't need to specify it any more than that. The same should be said of people with disabilities. What is lost are just those persons. Actually, often their families too. If we think artworks are of value, then there is a real loss of value. If we think persons are of value, there's a real loss of value." Katay isn't Christian, but she rightly recognizes the central importance of care on behalf of those with intellectual disabilities. Katay is well aware that even much of the history I've previously canvassed claims to be a way of caring for individuals, right? We institutionalize because we care. We forcibly sterilize because we care. We medically experiment because we care. Merely saying you care doesn't mean you're acting in a way that really contributes to another's flourishing. Katay thinks that the most important kind of care is a success term. That is, there's a normative sense of the word care that picks out care as it ought to be practiced, care that does what it's supposed to do, care that helps people flourish. And in her written work, she uses all caps care to talk about this kind of care. And it's hard to verbalize all caps care. I'll try to make it clear when she's talking about success care versus mere attempted care. We can perhaps think of misguided or vicious care as mere care. Care practices which are virtuous or actually bring about flourishing is what she calls all caps care. On Katay's view, proper care, virtuous care, is grounded in the flourishing of all parties, carer and care for alike. That one can care, in the normative sense, too much is just as incoherent to say as you can be too just or too loving. The purpose of care as a success term is flourishing, because people will be harmed if the care is not provided. Care work then isn't just an attitude. It's about doing the work needed for people to flourish, carving out space in the larger culture that devalues and marginalizes them. Doing this work is inherently political work, not in the overly narrow binary sense of US politics, but in the broader sense of our polis, our communities. In her book, Lean on Me, A Politics of Radical Care, Lynn Siegel writes that, quote, "Placing care and kindness at the heart of our politics is an indispensable step for achieving any caring future," end quote. It's another sentence I wish had been written by a Christian. We cannot properly care for others merely as individuals. Caring is a community act. It's a political act. I once actually had a colleague at my former university ask me, "Kevin, why do you always make disability so political?" And I said, "Because it is." Caring, in the normative sense, requires us to resist injustice. It requires us to advocate. As Katay Davidson, a Black disabled trans man pictured here on the right, put it shortly before he died, quote, "Advocacy is for all of us. Advocacy is a way of life. It's a natural response to the injustices and inequality in the world." So caring as a community becomes an act of solidarity. The word solidarity comes from the Latin solidum, to hold a debt together. If I see that somebody else in my community is harmed and can't bear that themselves, then I engage in solidarity when I help hold that debt. In their recent book on solidarity, Lee Hunt Hendricks and Astra Taylor that I mentioned earlier argue that solidarity, quote, calls us to act as moral agents, not because of complicity in past mindsets, but for the possibility of a more egalitarian future. Solidarity, they say, is not neutral. It involves taking a side against people who discriminate, pollute, exploit, and profiteer. End quote. So solidarity requires that to the degree we are able, we will engage in the work to undo oppression and marginalizing systems, that we will build the capacity to enable those we care about to flourish. In the present context, it means actively working to dismantle the ableist systems that people with intellectual disabilities face not only in their churches, but in every part of their life, that still constrain the lives of disabled people. In the closing minutes, I want to give an example of what the kind of care and solidarity I've been talking about could look like. It doesn't have to look like this. This is just one way. Sometimes stories can make the abstract more concrete. So here's going to be a bit of my family's story. But there are 3 dangers that I want to try and ward off before I tell it. First, this is just our story. Other stories will look different. Others will disagree with what I say here because their family needs for the flourishing of their intellectually disabled members are different than what we need. If you've not seen Chimamanda Adichie's excellent TED Talk, The Danger of a Single Story, you should watch it. It's fantastic. I show it to my classes. One of the things that's especially good about it is that she warns against, quote, a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity, end quote, that's all too rampant when it comes to disability in our culture. This is the story of a family with an intellectually disabled member, one who happens to be a child, not the story of all such families. This gets me to the second danger of our story, namely that it's a story about our son, and I'm telling it, and he's not. And that worries me. There's a danger of infantilizing that often happens when we talk about especially intellectually disabled individuals, as well as a host of dangers about speaking for those who are not yet able to tell their stories. In recent weeks at bedtime, since it's summer, bedtime's a bit more lax at our house. Our son asked me to tuck him in. He asks me to snuggle. And I talk with him about this talk. Because what I say about our family is his story. And he says it's okay. Finally, this is a story. I always get weepy. Sorry. I'm going to re-engage my crusty Grinch heart. Shrink it back down, compress. Finally, this is a story about systems. I'm going to talk about some of our family's experiences over the past few years in our local church. Here's a black and white image of the congregation that we go to. Our church is full of wonderful people. Pretty sure there are some of those people watching tonight. And I am not criticizing them. As I wrote on my blog a number of years ago, there's an important difference between criticizing a social structure and criticizing the people in that structure. I had a blog post about the curse of good intentions. Good intentions aren't enough. We need good social systems. And criticizing a social structure is not always criticizing the people that participate in it. Furthermore, even our structures are a result of larger cultural forces. And here the history of ableism is thick and deep. So please believe me when I say that my telling you this story is not to blame or criticize the individuals at my church, either clergy or laity. But I'm convinced that solidarity and care require honesty. And so in telling this story, I'm trusting that it will be received not as criticism, but as illustration of how the larger challenges families faced in an ableist culture can place burdens on them that can get in the way of their church involvement. As I've already said, I'm the parent of 3 wonderfully demanding children, including a now 16-year-old multiply disabled son. This is a screen image of a screen grab from a video that the Center for Philosophy of Religion at Notre Dame. And this is actually Jameson and I receiving Eucharist together in the church whose image I just showed. And if I wasn't always weepy, this image would make me weepy. Among his disabilities are intellectual disabilities, both cognitive and developmental. He's a wonderful human, and I'm pleased to be able to say that other than one bad experience, the people at our local church have always been very accommodating to him in the 8 years we've been going. One bad individual experience. That's pretty good. That said, however, we haven't had him at church more than a few times in the last 18 months. Last March, my father-in-law, who had lived with us for 7 years, died. The same week he died, we were told by the Christian school that our children had attended since we moved to Michigan that he was no longer welcome to return given his disabilities. And legally they can do that because of the exemption to the ADA. The switch to the high school from the middle school, a bigger, louder building, new staff that didn't know him, didn't listen to us, had been hard on him that year. And the church decided unilaterally he'd be better off somewhere else. Sorry, the school decided. I might have said church. During this, our family was abandoned by a local advocacy organization committed to making it so that everybody belongs, but where their relationship with the school was prioritized over his needs in ways we only found out when we requested his educational record. And then we got copies of their recommendations to the school that they were unwilling to share with us because how it could hurt the community. In addition to the Christian school that kicked him out, 3 others were not willing to make space for him, given his disabilities. He was forced to start over in a public school, which took him because they have to. Legally, they had to. And where he did not know a single person when he started. We had to work to build a new IEP while not being so forceful that we strained the relationship with that new school. So this past year has been one of increased depression and anxiety, not just for him, but for us. It's been a year of significant family struggles, and all this on top of failing to be able to get him the community living support services that he's qualified for the past 4 years. But given what the state is willing to pay, we have not been able to actually employ anyone. 30 hours of care work a week that we don't get because of the state financial coffers. We have to adjust mental health meds, which is tricky to do when disability makes it hard to understand your emotions or communicate with your parents. Having him at church feels like time where we have to manage him rather than worship. That's no way for us to feel as congregants, and it's certainly no way for him to feel as neurodivergent. And again, that is not because the people around us are in any way bad. They know him, they understand his echolalia, his wiggliness, his movement, but it just becomes an exercise in behavior management. I almost added an anti-ABA comment there, but I resisted. Again, let me stress that I greatly value our local church and the people in it. But virtually every social system we have to engage because of our son's disabilities, from insurance to schools to therapies to seeking legal remedies to ensuring his rights are protected, all of these put significant pressure on us as a family to make it happen. Time, money, energy. I've even written a paper on how the systems that are supposed to support our family too often become systems we have to struggle against. Rob Rosema in our congregation is the editor for AUT, the Journal of Autistic Culture. I often don't have good titles, but what are intended as systems of support become systems of struggle. If there is no place for our son in a church, there's no place for our family. It's as simple as that. And by space, I mean not only being welcome or having formal ministries, but place in our lives to navigate church in addition to everything else we have to navigate, to all the demands, all the commitments. I calculated I lose about 12 hours a week driving my son to and from school just so he doesn't have to spend 45 minutes each way on a bus by himself. Pretty sure that's 12 hours of sleep a week. What I'm asking for here seems to be rare. According to Eric's research, quote, the U.S. Congregational Life Survey found that just 10% of congregations nationally reported offering some form of care for people with disabilities, while 43% of parishes have a list of resources to refer people with disabilities for professional help. And honestly, those lists often take about 4 hours of calling name after name till you find the one person that actually transfers you to somebody else. A smaller percentage have support groups for people with disabilities or for families of members with disabilities, only about 16 or 17%. While there's no data on this that I'm aware of, I suspect even a smaller percentage of churches are lobbying to overturn the religious exemption to the ADA, funding the Individuals with Disabilities Act up to the 40% that it was supposed to be funded at when it was passed, but it has never gotten above 21% in its history. Advocating that the number of occupational therapy sessions that are covered by insurance go from 30 per year to 53. Advocating to change the law that allows our son to be paid below minimum wage simply because he has an intellectual disability. To fight the local businesses for ADA compliance so that we don't have to be the ones doing it, spending our limited social and emotional capacity on carving out space for our son when we shouldn't have to. It's just too damn tiring. What we need is a cultural change that the church is called to do. In his recent book, The Gospel According to James Baldwin, James Garrett says that, quote, to be a witness is to tell the truth about the lives we're living, the lies we're living. It is to stand up and say what is wrong and what is right, end quote. And it is this witness that many of us need for the sake of our intellectually disabled loved ones, because we're struggling, and the church is often just silent. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Well, we would like, if we have a little time left, we don't have too much time, so maybe 2 questions.
Sorry, I ran long.
I love it. Thank you. Maybe we can take just a couple questions. Is that all right? Mm-hmm. All right. I had a question prepared, but actually right at the end, as you're talking through these things that we can do, you kind of answered what I was anticipating asking. I do have a question, but I want to open it up first because I don't want to take our time with my question. Yeah.
Thank you, Kevin. Mm-hmm. What is the tipping point that is going to get congregations off this track of ableism? What do you think is that tipping point, that awareness, that big aha moment that is just going to end all this?
I wish I knew. I mean, I got to be honest, prior to our son being born and right, finding out about his disabilities, we were on the other side of the tipping point. Sometimes for individuals, it's, right, and most of the time for individuals, it's personal connection of some kind. But that kind of individual tipping point doesn't give us the cultural tipping point that we need. And I don't know, right? I mean, it took, think back, again, think of the comparison with the civil rights movement. It took national marches. It took seeing children bitten by dogs to get part of, right, our culture to be motivated. It took making what was prevalent but often behind closed doors happen out in public on national television for the tipping point. Part of what we need to do, I think, is, and I don't think it's going to be sufficient, but this is, I think, just telling the story, right? Like being on. I know that much of my talk is a downer. Welcome to me. Right? But we don't get people to work to move until they know how bad it is. And we don't know how bad it is if we pretend everything is okay and we don't tell the stories. I teach a class, I give long answers and I tell stories on disability advocacy and community here at Calvin. Every time I've taught the class, students come up to me and they're like, how come I knew about the women's suffrage movement and the civil rights movement, and I've never heard about the disability rights movement? Because our culture is just okay with you not knowing, right? Like, racism, sexism, misogyny are not like publicly acceptable for most folks. Public ableism sure is. And so, right, we need to get to that point where we all just stand up and say, this is not good for these folks, it is not good for us, it is not good for our community. And we need leadership to do that. And unfortunately, this is the last part of my answer, the disability rights movement is so very different than this racial civil rights movement, because I don't know a single church organization that was central in the disability rights movement. You've got groups like ADAPT that are literally chaining themselves to public buses. And then when Trump's was trying to undo the Affordable Care Act, where they went and they chained themselves in Congress again and had to be pulled off of their ventilators and their power chairs, right, in order to get anything done. And the church is not present in those moments of suffering, in those moments of justice. I don't know what it will take, but as Christians, we're called to be at the vanguard, and we're not.
Is there another question for Kevin?
It's going to be a long question.
Good. Give me a minute to think and to drink.
I was removed from Christian school in second grade because of my disabilities. I'm neurodiverse. And sent to a public school. I was bullied mercilessly in public school. I was bullied here when I came to Calvin in '79. I was even bullied a little bit maybe in the seminary later on. To the point where I was beat up in my room one late night by a bunch of drunk students. To the point where somebody threw firecrackers into my door and set my closet on fire. You know how I survived that? The one thing I never hear in the disability rights movement, and it's angering me severely, there's one Christian virtue that could be the tipping point, and nobody's saying it. I got through it because of forgiveness. And it's angering me that I did not hear it here tonight. I feel bad for your son in all that he's put up with, because I put up with it myself. But when are we going to, that is the most radical, Christian, subversive, counterintuitive thing is forgiveness, and we don't practice it. Can you please tell me why you're not preaching that?
I love the question. Thank you. I think I want to say two things. Maybe I'm just not there yet. right? It could be, this has been hard. I am angry. I have been angry for years. I suspect I will be for years more. I'm actually not convinced that anger is always bad. Again, I've read Jeremiah. Yeah. No, that's good. No, I seriously, like, I'm a philosopher, right? I like the hard questions, at least in theory. Okay. I think that's part of it. But again, to illustrate here, I mean, imagine we went to the civil rights movement and just said only forgiveness. Now, King was about forgiveness, right? But King was also about structural change, transformation, accountability, civil rights protection, and social action. The two are not incompatible.
No, they're not. But when I think of Christ on the cross saying, forgive them, they don't know what they're doing. I can do it. But somebody better may close up the fire.
Sure. And again, maybe someday I'll come to that point. I'm not there yet. I'm not convinced that anything that I have said today is incompatible with forgiveness, because forgiveness does not entail leaving social structures as broken as they are. It does not entail allowing other people to continue to be marginalized. It does not entail that we don't push and do all the hard stuff. And so there's tomorrow I fly to Alabama and I give another related talk, religious freedom, disability, discrimination, and civic virtue. And there at the last part of the talk, I actually go through about 7 virtues that I think are at the heart, right, of trying to address these problems. And this talk wasn't that talk. This talk is actually nicer than that one in various ways, believe it or not. Right. So even though I've already gone over, there's only so much that you can do, right? But there's, I think of Bonhoeffer. By the way, if you know anything about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he came to his views largely by coming to the U.S. and working with an intellectually disabled community. And that is what led him to go back and resist the Third Reich. But I think of Bonhoeffer's distinction between cheap grace and costly grace. And I think there's cheap forgiveness and there's costly forgiveness. And sometimes the call for forgiveness is a call to manage other people. And I'm not saying this is true of you, right? I don't know you, your experiences. I love the honesty and the self-disclosure behind your, right? But sometimes the call for other people to forgive is a call just to manage them. And again, I'm not saying that this is true of you, right? We need costly grace. We need costly forgiveness. But costly grace requires us to do the hard work to change this, to change the structures, right? It is what led Bonhoeffer, the very same person that said, when Christ calls a person, Christ bids them come and die. And it led Bonhoeffer to engage in the attempt to assassinate Hitler, for which he was ultimately killed. And I am not here calling, so anybody associated with Calvin, hear this, I am not calling for attempted assassinations, right? I lean pacifist many days. That's just true. I'm not convinced that pacifism is always the best political option, right? But sometimes we have to do things that are going to make us innocent. And there's a way of asking to play nice that I think is just a weaponization of control. And I don't want to have that. There's space in the Christian life for forgiveness and anger at the same time. Anger is no sin. Honesty is no sin. So let's have all of the things, including forgiveness. And I appreciate the reminder. Thank you.
I think we can ask one last question.
Sure.
If I don't see anybody, I'm going to go ahead and ask mine. So all of us are in different positions in relation to people with intellectual disability. It might be ourselves, a family member, teacher, congregant, client. How do we step forward and approach the care and solidarity that is needed, even in our own spaces when some people are doing pretty isolated work?
Yeah, that's great. I mean, part of it is the more that you know what a person or a family is going through, right? You're going to know what they need. Maybe there's somebody in my local congregation that actually knows how to get our son's OT billed so that we don't have to pay out of pocket for 22 weekly therapies a year. Actually, we figured this out. If they bill it as ABA therapy, 52 a week are covered. If they bill it as OT, they only cover 30. That's fascinating, right? So sometimes it's just knowing what people are struggling with. But it's hard to know what people are struggling with if you don't know them well, and all the things that I've talked about here get in the way of knowing people well, right? Our family, we've lived here 8 years. We've had a babysitter once. Our daughters are old enough now that for short periods of time, they can watch themselves and our son can call us if something comes up. But probably more than once a month, we turn down social invites just because all the mental energy, effort, emotional labor to get ready and then we go and then we're distracted, right? It's just not worth it. So involvement, but all of this that I've been saying, right, gets in the way of involvement. And so that's part of it. One other part, and again, this might not be agreed by everyone, but again, I'm a philosopher. Nobody agrees with everything I say. We have to realize that the Christian faith isn't just about us in our local church or us in. I hate the Footprints poem. I hate the Footprints poem with a passion. It's never just you and Jesus. It's always you and Jesus and the whole church, the communion of saints, the body of Christ. The Christian faith is one of, in the right sense of this word, political social engagement. We need more of that. And so I think that I did not say I rate hookers. Now I just did. It's going to get better. I have promised to watch this with my 11-year-old once it's up on YouTube. So I will get to explain I rate hookers to our daughter. Anyway, sorry. I just saw some, I got so Kate, sorry about that. Part of it's going to take, we need to remember that the Christian faith calls, right? I mean, this is Calvin, every square inch. That includes the halls of Congress. That includes the boards of therapy, right? Insurance companies that care more about economic benefit than they do providing care. We need to be all those places making things better. And so it's nothing short than the radical transformation of all parts of our culture. But that's a big ask. And I can't do that. You can't do that. The church as Christ's body through Christ's grace is the only option we have. Right? But we are the body. We are the hands. We can't just sit on the sideline and let these things continue.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin.
No. Can I hug you? I seriously,